I left on a Tuesday in October, when Ada was 3 years old, and the cottonwoods along the creek were just beginning to go gold. She was standing on the porch rail. Willa had hold of the back of her dress, keeping her from pitching forward, and I remember that Ada had both fists wrapped around the rail post and her chin resting on her hands, watching me saddle Creed in the yard. She didn't cry. She was not yet the kind of child who cried much. She saved that for later, for when she was tired and the dark came in and she couldn't find whatever small thing she'd put down and lost. At 3, she mostly watched. Big gray eyes, her mother's straight brown hair, her grandmother Cord's stubborn chin. She watched me cinch the saddle and check the rifle and tie the bedroll, and she didn't say a word until I came up the porch steps and knelt in front of her. "You coming back, Daddy?" she said. I looked at her face and I looked at Willa standing just behind her, and I said, "I'm coming back for your birthday." She thought about that. Her birthday was in April. It was October. She was 3 years old and didn't entirely have a grip yet on how far April was, and I am not proud to say I was counting on that. "Promise?" she said. "Promise," I said. I kissed her forehead, and I kissed Willa on the cheek, and I rode out of the yard, and I didn't look back until I was past the first stand of box elders, and by the time I got there the porch was empty. That was 6 years ago. I tell it now the way it sits in me, not the way I told it to myself on the road back, which was lighter and cleaner, and involved a good deal of self-justification that I had mostly worn through by the time I crossed into Bitter Sage Flats County. The truth of it is this: I had made a promise I didn't keep. Not that April. Not the April after. Not the one after that. I sent letters when I could, and money when I had it, and I told myself I was doing right by them in the only way the work allowed. And for a while, I believed that. For a long while. It was Captain Reese Morrow who finally set me straight, and he did it without a word. We were 3 days north of the Briar Wash crossing, me and Morrow and 2 other men from the Territorial Frontier Company, and we'd stopped to camp beside a dry creek bed that still had a little water running under the rocks. Morrow was a quiet man, a widower who had a son back east somewhere that he'd seen maybe 4 times in 5 years. He sat at the fire that evening and he took a letter out of his coat pocket, not to read. I don't think he was reading it. And he just held it in his hands and looked at the fire, and after a long time he set it on his knee and said, without looking at me, "A man can ride for a thing his whole life and arrive to find it already done." I didn't ask him what he meant. I knew what he meant. I put in my papers 2 weeks later. It took 3 months to clear, and then I rode south. I did not write ahead. I wasn't sure yet if I had the right. The road into Bitter Sage Flats comes down off a long limestone shelf and then drops into the valley, and from the shelf you can see the whole flat spread of it, the town of Fenwick at the center, with its 2 church steeples and its grain elevator, and the ranch roads going out like spokes from a wheel, and off to the northeast, the line of cottonwoods along Sutter Creek that marks the edge of my land. Our land. Willa's land. By every honest account, since she had been the one working it. I sat my horse on the shelf for a good long time. Creed shifted under me, impatient. The late September sun was already low, and the valley was going amber and long-shadowed, and somewhere out there past the cottonwoods was a 9-year-old girl who had been told, by her father, on a promise, that he was coming back for her birthday. She had now had 6 birthdays without him. I will not dress up what I felt. It was not a clean feeling. It had shame in it, and something that sat lower than shame, and under that, a wanting so plain and old it had lost most of its language. I wanted to go home. I had wanted to go home since about the 3rd month I was gone, and I had spent 6 years being too proud, or too busy, or too much of a coward to do it. And now, I was finally here, and I was sitting on a limestone shelf in the last of the afternoon sun, not moving. Creed solved that. He got tired of the shelf and started down the road, and I let him. By the time I reached the Cord Ranch gate, the light was failing. The gate was new, newer than the one I remembered, which had been a 2-rail pine affair that had needed replacing since before I left. This one was solid cedar, hung level, with a proper latch. Someone had done good work on it. I got down to open it, walked Creed through, and latched it behind me. The house looked cared for. The south porch post I'd been meaning to replace since our first winter had been replaced. Cedar again, matching the gate. which told me someone had bought the posts in one trip and done both jobs at once. There was a kitchen garden still going along the east wall, end-of-season beans mostly, and a cord of firewood split and stacked in the lean-to that would see them well past January. The barn door hung true. The yard fence was tight. I stood in the yard with Creed's reins in my hand and the dark coming in, and I was looking at 6 years of Willa's work, and I understood, in a way the road had not quite taught me, exactly what I had done and what it had cost her. The kitchen light was on. I tied Creed at the post and climbed the porch steps and knocked on my own door. There was a silence inside, the kind you get when someone has heard an unexpected sound and gone still. Then footsteps. Not the small, fast ones of a child, the deliberate, measured ones of a woman who has learned not to rush toward things that might disappoint her. The door opened, and Willa was standing there with a dish towel in her hands and lamplight behind her, and she looked at me for a long time without saying anything. I had not forgotten what she looked like, but I had let the memory go soft around the edges, the way memories do when you don't want them to hurt. She looked the way a woman looks after 6 years of being the only grown person on a working ranch, capable and undeceived, with a steadiness in her face that hadn't been quite so deep when I left. Her hair was pinned up, and her dress was clean and ordinary, and she had flour on one wrist from whatever she'd been doing when I knocked. She was, if anything, more herself than she had been when I rode out. 6 years had not diminished her. They had refined her, the way hard use refines good iron. She looked at me, and I looked at her, and she said, "Clem." Not a question, not a greeting particularly. Just my name, said the way you say a word you've turned over in your mind so many times it's almost worn smooth. "Willa," I said. "You'd better put your horse in the barn," she said. "There's stall room." She turned back into the kitchen, and I went and put Creed in the barn. Old Doss was in there. He'd been on the ranch since before Willa's father left her the place, a small leather-faced man with a gray mustache, and he looked at me from the end stall where he was bedding one of the mares, and he said, "Huh," and went back to his work. I took that as about what I deserved. I unsaddled Creed, rubbed him down, measured his grain, and hung my gear on the empty pegs inside the barn door. They were the same pegs I'd put in myself the first winter, and the top one still had a slight lean to it that I'd always meant to fix. I stood there, looking at that peg for a moment, and then I went back across the yard and let myself into the kitchen. Willa had set a plate at the end of the table, beans and cornbread, and a piece of salt pork. Nothing fancy. The same supper she would have made if I hadn't been there. There was a cup of coffee next to the plate. I sat down and ate, and she stood at the counter finishing whatever she'd been doing, working steadily, not looking at me much. After a while I said, "Where's Ada?" "Asleep," Willa said. "She goes down at 8. I looked at the window. It was past 9. "She do all right in school?" "She does very well in school," Willa said, in a tone that made clear the doing well in school had nothing to do with me. "The place looks good," I said. "The gate." "The porch post." "Prior Fitch put up the gate. I hired it done." She said it evenly, without emphasis, which was worse than if she'd said it with emphasis. Prior Fitch. I knew the name. The Fitch land ran along our north fence, a good-sized spread. I had not known Prior Fitch well before I left. He'd been new to the county then. I filed the name away and said nothing. "I'm not asking anything of you," I said after a while. "I know I don't have that right. I wanted to come home." She turned around then and looked at me. Her face was not angry. That would have been easier. It was measured. The face of a woman who has had 6 years to work through every version of this conversation and has arrived at a place beyond the easy feelings. "You can stay in the barn," she said, "until we know what this is." "Yes," I said. "That's fair. I'll tell Ada in the morning," she said. "I won't have her startled." "Yes," I said. "Thank you." She went back to her work, and I finished my coffee, and I took myself out to the barn and made a bed in the empty stall next to Creed, with the extra blankets I found on a peg, and I lay there listening to the horses breathe and the night settling in over the bitter sage flats, and I thought, this is where you start. You do not start anywhere else. You start here, in the barn you built with your own hands, in the dark, on the floor, because you left and she stayed, and that is the shape of things now. You start here, and you do the work, And you don't ask for anything that hasn't been earned. I slept better than I had in years. In the morning, I was up before first light and had the horses fed and watered and the barn swept before Doss came in. And when he got there and saw what had been done, he gave me the same, huh, as the night before. Only this time, it sounded fractionally less like a judgment. I was splitting wood in the side yard when the back door opened and Ada came out. She had on a brown wool dress and her hair was in a braid, and she was carrying a school slate under one arm, and she stopped at the edge of the porch and looked at me. I put the axe down. She had her mother's face now more than I'd remembered, but she had my height in her even at 9, and the gray eyes were all cored. She looked at me the way she had looked at me from the porch rail 6 years ago, quietly, taking inventory, not in any hurry to speak. "Mama said you're my father," she said. "Yes," I said. She considered that. "You've been gone a long time." "I have," I said. 6 years, she said. "Mama marks it on the calendar. There's a mark for when you left, and marks for when the letters came." She said this without accusation, only as a statement of recorded fact, which was somehow more difficult to bear than accusation would have been. "There weren't very many marks for the letters," she added. "No," I said. "There weren't." She looked at the woodpile I'd been building. "Are you going to stay?" "I'd like to," I said, "if your mother says it's all right, and if you're all right with it." She thought about that for a moment, her chin doing that same stubborn set her grandmother used to get when she was working something out. Then she said, "I have to go to school," and went back inside. That was the whole of the first conversation. I went back to splitting wood. Willa came out a few minutes later to take Ada to school. She drove her in the wagon, a 2-mile run to the Fenwick schoolhouse, and as she passed me in the yard she said, without stopping, "Don't go into the house while I'm gone." "I won't," I said. She didn't say anything else, and I went back to work. What followed was a week of that kind of careful, plain-spoken arrangement. I worked the ranch from before first light until supper. Doss and I got the east fence mended, 2 sections that had gone over in a summer storm and hadn't been gotten to, and I cleaned the barn floor and repointed the chimney on the hay shed and replaced 3 boards on the south side of the house that had gone soft. I slept in the barn. I ate supper at the end of the table in the kitchen, the meals that Willa set out, and the conversation was sparse and practical. She told me what wanted doing and I did it. Ada came home from school in the afternoons and did her lessons at the kitchen table, and sometimes looked at me, and sometimes didn't. On the 4th day she came out to the fence where I was working, and stood on the bottom rail and watched me for a while. I kept working. After a bit she said, "Did you have a horse in the war?" "I had a horse named Creed," I said. "Same one I've got now." "Was it scary?" she said. "Sometimes," I said. "Mostly, it was just a long ride." "Did you shoot anybody?" "Ada," I said. "Mama says I ask too many questions." "Your mama is right," I said. "But you can ask whatever you want." She thought about that trade for a moment. "Didn't you miss us?" I stopped working and looked at her. She was watching me with those level gray eyes, and I could see she wanted a straight answer, not a soft one. She was 9. She had been getting straight answers from her mother for 6 years, and she knew the difference. "Every day," I said. "I missed you every single day, and I should have come home a great deal sooner than I did. That's the truth of it." She looked at me for another moment. Then she said, "What does Creed like to eat?" "Oats," I said, "and he'll steal an apple if you let him near one." "We have apples," she said. "I know," I said. "I've been keeping him away from the tree." She almost smiled. It was brief, a small movement at the corner of her mouth, and then it was gone, and she climbed off the fence rail and went back to the house. But it was there. I saw it. On the 5th day Prior Fitch came by. He rode in on a good bay horse, well dressed for a working rancher, a man in his middle 40s, thickly built, with a broad open face, and the kind of confidence that comes from a run of good years. He had a neighborly manner, easy and unhurried, and he came to the porch where Willa was, and touched his hat and said, "Morning, Willa. Saw smoke from the chimney on the west side. Wanted to make sure you didn't have a trouble." "No trouble," Willa said. "My husband came home." A silence followed that sentence. Fitch looked past her, to where I'd come around the corner of the house with a hammer in my hand, and he took that in, and then he looked back at Willa, with an expression that was hard to read exactly. Not angry, not especially surprised, more the look of a man doing a quick and private recalculation. "That's so," he said. "That's so," said Willa. He looked back at me. "Clem Cord," he said, as if checking whether the name fit the man in front of him. "That's right," I said. "Prior Fitch. I've been neighbor on your north line since about a year after you left." "I know who you are," I said. He nodded. There was a pause in which several things went unsaid by all three of us, and then he said, "Well, good to have the place properly manned again. If you need anything in the way of equipment or an extra pair of hands, my offer stands." He said that last part to Willa, not to me. "Thank you, Prior," she said. "We'll manage." He touched his hat again and rode out. I watched him go, and then looked at Willa. She was watching Fitch ride up the north road, her face settled and still. "He's been decent to us," she said, and that was all she said about it, and I understood it was the whole of what she meant to tell me on the subject. I went back to my work, but I stood at the fence for a while after Fitch's bay disappeared past the tree line, holding the hammer and not using it. I was not angry at the man, a decent neighbor who had watched a woman manage a working ranch alone for 6 years and had offered help with a gate. That was nothing to be angry about. What I felt was something colder and more private, the knowledge that what I had vacated, other men had filled around the edges. Not the center of things. Willa was too much herself for that, and she had kept that center exactly as she chose, but the ordinary practical outside of things, the gate and the porch post and the neighborly word in difficult seasons. A man should be those things for his own family. I had not been. Someone else had picked up what I'd dropped, and I had no right to any feeling about that other than gratitude that it had been picked up and shame that it had needed to be. I drove 3 fence staples and moved down the line. By noon I had worked through most of what I needed to work through, which was the way hard work has always served me best. Not for the thinking it lets you do, but for the thinking it lets you finish. That evening at supper, Ada ate her beans and cornbread, and then looked at me and said, "Did you remember about my birthday?" Willa went still across the table. I put my fork down. "I remembered," I said. "You promised you'd come back for my birthday," Ada said. 6 years ago. I was 3. "I know," I said. "You didn't come," she said. "No," I said. "I didn't." She looked at me steadily. "Why not?" I could feel Willa watching me, not the way she'd been watching me all week, measuring and guarded, but differently, more carefully, like she wanted to know the answer herself. "Because I let the work take up more room than it should have," I said, "and because I was afraid." Ada frowned. "Afraid of what?" I thought about that. I thought about the limestone shelf and Creed deciding for me, and the long road down and 6 years of wait, arriving in the form of a cedar gate, well hung by another man's hands. "Afraid that I'd waited too long," I said, "that I'd broken the promise, and the promise was the last thing holding the door open, and if I came back and you didn't want me there, I wouldn't have anything left to ride back to at all." It was a long thing to say to a 9-year-old, and I wasn't sure I'd gotten it right. Ada looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "When's my birthday?" "April the 14th, I said without hesitating. She nodded slowly. "All right," she said, and picked up her fork, and that was the end of it for that evening. But she looked at me differently after that, not warm yet, not close, but with a kind of fresh attention, the way you look at something that has surprised you in a direction you hadn't counted on. Willa didn't say a word about any of it, but when she passed behind my chair to get the coffee pot, she let her hand rest for just a moment on the back of the chair, a light and passing thing, barely a touch, and then she moved on. 2 weeks in, the first real test came. I'd been up on the north ridge checking the upper pasture fence when the weather turned fast, the way it does in Bitter Sage Flats, a warm morning sliding into a black sky afternoon without much warning. And by the time I got back to the lower field, the rain was driving hard, and the creek was already running fast. Doss met me at the barn and said the Sutter Creek culvert on the east road was going to go if the water kept up, and if it went, we'd lose the bridge footing and have no road into Fenwick until it was rebuilt. I knew that culvert. I'd built it. I knew exactly what it needed. We worked through 3 hours of hard rain and slippery footing, me and Doss and one of Doss's nephews who'd come by for supper, and ended up with his boots full of creek water instead. It was after dark when we got the diversion trench cut, and the culvert shored, and the worst of the pressure off the footing. We came back to the barn soaked through, and Doss's nephew, a good-natured boy of 17 named Hector, could not stop grinning about it, the way young men grin about weather when they've come through it, as if they've settled a personal score with the sky. I went in through the back of the house, not wanting to track mud through the kitchen, and I sat down on the back step to pull my boots off in the dark. The kitchen door opened, and Willa was there with a lamp, and she looked at me sitting on the step and said, "Take those off. Come inside." "I'm dripping," I said. "I know you're dripping," she said. "Come inside." I left my boots on the step and came in, and she had the stove going and a pot of coffee on and a dry shirt of mine, an old one I'd left when I went, hanging still on the same peg in the back room, and she set these things in front of me, the way she set supper in front of me, efficiently and without ceremony, and I understood she did not want to be thanked for them. I changed the shirt and drank the coffee, and she sat across the table from me with her own cup. "Hector all right?" she said. "Soaked but grinning," I said. "You know how boys are with weather." "Doss?" "Doss is fine, drier than me. He knows how to work weather." "I forgot." She almost smiled. "You forgot a lot of things." "I did," I said. She looked into her cup. The lamp was between us on the table, and the kitchen was warm against the rain coming down outside, and after a while she said, "The culvert holds?" "It'll hold," I said. "I built it to hold." A pause. Then she said, "You built most of this." I didn't answer that right away, because I was hearing in it something she might not have intended me to hear, and I didn't want to take it wrong. But she looked up at me, and she had that direct level look that she'd had since the night she opened the door, the look that said she had earned the right to say exactly what she meant, and expected the same courtesy back. "I did," I said. "I've been keeping it," she said. "I know," I said. "I've been watching you keep it, and I've been ashamed of myself every day." She held my eyes for a moment, then she looked back at her cup. "Ada took Creed an apple this morning," she said, "before school." Something loosened in my chest. "I know," I said. He thanked her for it by trying to eat her hair. "She thought that was the funniest thing that's happened all year," Willa said. I smiled. It was the first time I'd smiled fully since I came back. "She's got your patience with animals," I said. She talked to him for a good 10 minutes before she offered the apple. Most people just walk up and put the thing in front of a horse. Willa looked at me, and this time the small smile came and held. "She's got your way of taking the long way around to the thing she actually wants," she said, and stood up and took our cups to the counter, and the conversation was done. But it was different after that. Not fixed. We were nowhere near fixed, but different. The temperature of things had shifted a degree or two towards something that was no longer only distance. I kept sleeping in the barn. I did not ask to change that arrangement. But in the mornings, Willa had taken to leaving the back door unlatched, so I could get my coffee without knocking, and she had begun saying more than the strictly necessary number of words at supper. And once, only once, early, I had come up to the porch in the late afternoon and found Ada sitting on the top step with a tablet of paper, drawing something, and she had said, without looking up, "Daddy, what does a mountain look like?" "Exactly?" I had sat down on the step beside her and told her what a mountain looked like, exactly, and she had drawn it, and then she had moved the tablet over so I could see, and I said, "That's it, pretty much." And she said, "Does it look scary?" And I said, "No, just big, just very big and very old and very quiet." She thought about that and wrote the words at the bottom of her drawing, "Big and old and quiet." Then she went inside for supper. I sat on that step a while longer before I followed. By the end of the first month I was sleeping in the back room. Willa did not make an announcement about this. She simply put a quilt on the rope cot in the back room one evening and left the lamp burning in there, and when I came in from locking up the barn, I saw it, and I went in and shut the door and lay down, and I was asleep before I had time to think about it. In the morning, I found she had mended the cot's bad leg while I was out during the day, so it no longer tilted. Doss observed this development with the same two-syllable of commentary he'd applied to everything else since my arrival, which was, "Huh," followed by silence, followed by going back to work. I respected him for that. Ada, for her part, had begun stopping by the fence when I was working, not every day, but often enough that I came to recognize her particular way of approaching, the measured step, the hands in her pockets, the sideways look that meant she had a question she was working up to. I had learned to keep working and let her get there on her own time. Her questions ranged from the practical, "Why do you tie off the wire on the near post and not the far one?" to the abruptly personal, "Did you have a best friend in the company?" To the philosophical, "Mama says a promise is the most serious thing you can make because it means you're giving away part of what you are. Is that true?" On that last one, I'd stopped and straightened and looked at her. "Yes," I said, "that's true." She nodded slowly, as if confirming something she'd already mostly decided. "Then a broken promise takes away part of what you are," she said. "Yes," I said, "it does. Can you get it back?" I thought about that. Creed blew out a breath somewhere behind me in the pasture. The cottonwoods were going gold along the creek, same as they'd been when I left 6 years ago, and the light was low and long and amber in the way it only gets in Bitter Sage Flats in October. "I think," I said carefully, "that you can't get back exactly what you gave away, but you can build something honest in its place. If you work at it long enough, and don't ask for it before you've earned it." She looked at the cottonwoods for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, and what's wrong with the post at the bend?" And we went back to work. That night at supper she said, entirely without preamble, "Daddy says you can build something honest in the place of what you broke, if you work long enough." She was looking at her plate when she said it, not at either of us. I kept my eyes on my own plate. Willa was quiet for a moment, then she said, "That's true, and then, eat your supper." November came in sharp and cold, earlier than usual. I got the last of the hay bales in under cover, and Winter banked the cellar and wrapped the pipes on the pump house, and Doss went home to his sister's place in Fenwick for the worst months, which was what he'd been doing since Willa's father first hired him. Doss's departure meant it was the three of us, and the days got shorter and the evenings in the kitchen got longer. We played cards some evenings. Ada was ferocious at cards. She had a memory for what had been played that was frankly unfair in a 9-year-old, and she won consistently and without apology, which I admired. Willa played with a dry wit, folding bad hands without expression, and winning good ones without satisfaction, which was, I thought, about how she approached most things. I lost often, and didn't mind it. We read in the evenings, each of us separately. Willa had a stack of books on the kitchen shelf that had grown considerably since I left, and Ada had her own stack on the floor beside the wood box, and I had found my old surveying manual and some pamphlets from the Territorial Land Office that I'd been meaning to read since roughly 1879. The fire talked, and the lamp burned, and outside the wind worked over the Bitter Sage Flats, and inside it was warm and quiet and ordinary, and I sat in that ordinariness, night after night, and felt the weight of what I'd been away from, until the weight of it finally started to lift. The way a long grief lifts, not all at once, not with any clear moment you can point to, but by degrees, the way ice comes off a creek in the first real days of March. One night in December, Ada fell asleep at the table over her schoolbook. She was reading about rivers, and she'd been asking questions about the Colorado all through supper, and somewhere between the Rio Bravo and the question of whether rivers could think, she'd gone down with her cheek on the page and her hand still on the book, asleep as completely as only children can be asleep. Willa was reading at the other end of the table, and she looked up and saw Ada sleeping, and she said, quietly so as not to wake her, "Will you carry her?" I picked her up. She was heavier than I'd expected. Not heavy, but more solid than the 3-year-old in the brown coat I'd been holding in my memory for 6 years. She didn't wake. I carried her back to her room, and laid her down, and pulled the quilt up, and I stood there for a moment in the dark, looking at her, the way you look at something you almost lost for good. When I came back to the kitchen, Willa was still at the table, her book face down on the table, and her hands around her coffee cup. She looked at me when I came in, and she said, "Sit down, Clem." I sat down. She looked at her coffee cup for a moment, and then she looked at me, and she said, "I am not going to say it's all right. What you did, being gone 6 years, I'm not going to say that, because it's not all right, and I think you know it's not all right." "I know," I said. "And I'm not going to say I wasn't angry, she said. Because I was. For a long time, I was very angry, and then I was just tired, and then I just went on. Because going on was what there was to do. I know, I said. She was quiet for a moment. She used to ask me, she said. For the first 2 or 3 years, she used to ask me when you were coming home, and I used to say I wasn't sure, and then she stopped asking. She said this plainly, not as a weapon, but as a fact she thought I needed to have. She didn't stop asking, because she stopped caring, Willa said. She stopped asking, because she'd decided you might not come, and she was trying to arrange herself around that. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. She's been rearranging herself back, Willa said. Since you came, slowly, you probably see it. I see it, I said. So do I. She was quiet again. The fire settled, and she looked at it, and then back at me. I don't know yet what I want, she said. I want you to understand that. I don't know what this is yet. I know what I'd like it to be. But that's not the same thing. No, I said. It's not. What I know, she said, is that you've been here 2 months, and every day I find something fixed that I'd given up on fixing. And Ada talked more at supper in the first month you were here than she had in the 6 months before. And when she fell asleep just now, she was dreaming about rivers, because you told her at supper how the Colorado cuts through the canyon rock, and she couldn't stop thinking about it. She paused. She hadn't fallen asleep at the table since she was 5. She looked at me steadily. I am telling you that I see it, she said. I am not telling you anything else yet. Do you understand? Yes, I said. I understand. She nodded and picked up her book. Go to bed, Clem. I went to bed. I lay on the rope cot in the back room, and the wind pushed at the house and the fire talked itself down to coals. And I thought about a woman who had spent 6 years managing a working ranch and raising a 9-year-old and keeping herself from becoming bitter, which is by any honest measure a harder thing than what I had done, which was ride with a company of men, which is its own kind of loneliness, but is also its own kind of company, and has action in it, and motion and purpose, and does not ask you to sit still and endure. What she had done was endure. She had endured and she had kept things. She had kept the land and the child and herself, and she had kept them well, and she had not asked me for credit for it, and she was not going to ask me for credit for it. She was the most solid person I had ever known, and I had left her alone for 6 years, and what I wanted more than anything else in the world was to be worthy of that solidity. I figured I had about 40 years of work ahead of me to get there. I fell asleep. January and February were the hard months, the ones that test a ranch and the people on it. The cold came in earnest in early January, and the creek froze, and the stock needed twice the tending, and the days were short and gray. I did not find it hard. I found it, if I'm honest, close to what I'd been needing, work that was concrete and unambiguous, demands that showed up fresh every morning and could be met. I had spent 6 years on work that was always half invisible, always in the middle of something that might be almost done, or might stretch another season, and the daily requirements of a ranch in winter were a clarification I hadn't known I needed. This wants doing, do it. This is fixed, move on. Ada had taken to helping me in the barn in the mornings before school. She was a natural hand with animals, patient, quiet, sure, and she had made a particular friend of Creed, who would put his big head over the stall rail and breathe on her like an old dog whenever she came near. She talked to him steadily, the way she talked to everything she was comfortable with, which was a thing I'd only just started to earn. One morning in February, cold enough that our breath came in clouds, and the water in the trough had to be broken twice before noon, she was brushing Creed's near shoulder, and she said, without looking at me, "Daddy, are you going to leave again?" I was forking hay into the far stall, and I stopped and set the fork against the rail. "No," I said. She kept brushing. "How do you know?" "Because there's nothing I want to ride toward," I said. "Everything I want is here." She thought about that for a long time, long enough that I had finished with the hay and come back and started checking Creed's near foreleg, which had been a little hot the day before. Nothing serious. She was working the brush in slow, even strokes, the way she always did with Creed, unhurried, letting him settle into it, and Creed had his eyes half closed and his lower lip gone loose, which was about the highest compliment he paid to anybody. Then she said, "Okay." That was all. Okay. She went back to brushing, and I went back to the leg, and Creed stood still for both of us. But that evening after supper, while Willa was washing up, Ada came and stood beside my chair and said, "You can put your arm around me if you want." I put my arm around her, and she stood there leaning against my shoulder for about a minute and a half, which is a long time for a 9-year-old to stand still, and then she said okay again and went to get her school book. And Willa, who had her back to us at the counter, did not turn around, but I could see that she had stopped washing up for the full minute and a half, and afterward, she moved with a lighter hand. March came in warm, which was unusual, and the creek ran high and fast with the melt, and the kitchen garden that Willa had planned against the east wall started to look like it might get its seeds in earlier than expected. We planted together one Saturday, all three of us on our knees in the turned earth, and Ada had opinions about where the beans should go that she expressed with complete confidence, and Willa overruled 2 of them and accepted one, and I stayed out of it and handed tools, which seemed to be the correct role. It was a good Saturday. The garden plot ran 12 feet along the east wall, a mix of beans and onions, and the row of carrots Willa had been trying to get right for 3 years, and this year finally had the soil prepared properly for. Ada had done the preparation herself, working it in the evenings after school, breaking up the clay and turning in the wood ash and the compost from the bin beside the barn. She had not asked for help with it, she had just done it, and when I'd offered one evening she'd said she had it under control, which she did. The carrots were going in 4 inches apart, and she had a string stretched between 2 sticks to keep the row true, which was a surveying habit that she could only have gotten from me since it was not how Willa planted. And seeing it, I felt something that was equal parts pride and sorrow for all the years I hadn't been there to see such things develop. Willa planted the onion sets with the quick, sure movements of someone who'd done it many seasons, pressing them in at the right depth without measuring, her hands knowing what her eyes had long since stopped needing to check. I kept the soil turned and loose ahead of her, and tried not to be in anyone's way, and Ada directed operations in the bean row with the unself-conscious authority of someone who had earned that authority through actual preparation of the ground. "Dad, you're making the row too wide," she said, not looking up. "I'm loosening the soil," I said. "Mama's row is fine. Just do what Mama does." Willa, kneeling 3 feet away, said nothing, but her shoulders moved in a way that might have been a laugh suppressed. I did what Willa did. The row came out fine. I had been back for 6 months, and April was coming on. I knew what April meant. I had not brought it up. Ada had not brought it up since that evening at the supper table in October, but I had not forgotten it, and I was certain she had not either. She was not a child who forgot things, any more than her mother was a woman who forgot things. April the 14th, her birthday. I had promised, 6 years ago and 2 weeks ago in her memory, and roughly forever in mine, that I would come home for her birthday. I had come home, finally, in September. I had been here through the hard winter and the early spring, and I had fixed what I could fix and earned what I had earned, and I was still here. But the promise was the promise, not the return. The return was the beginning. The promise was the birthday. In the first week of April, I rode into Fenwick on a Tuesday morning. It was not a shopping day. Our shopping was Saturdays mostly, and Willa looked at me when I saddled Creed, but didn't ask. She had started to do that, to give me the room to have purposes she didn't know, which was trust of a kind I was careful not to be careless with. In Fenwick, I went to Halloran's Dry Goods, and I talked for a while with Mrs. Halloran, who knew Ada and what she liked and what she'd been wanting, the way a general store woman in a small county always knows, and Mrs. Halloran told me several things, and I bought what she suggested, and one other thing I'd had in mind for a while, and I came home with it in my saddlebag and put it in the back room. On the evening of the 13th, Willa came to the back room door and knocked. She always knocked now, a courtesy I was grateful for, and I said come in, and she did, and she looked at what was on the rope cot. There was a proper saddlebag, sized for a girl, tan leather, with Ada's initials stamped into the flap, AC, and a small carved horse inside it, well made, the same kind I'd left her when I rode out 6 years ago, because the one I'd left her was the smallest and roughest thing, a quick carving I'd done in an hour the night before I went, and she had kept it all this time, but it deserved better company. Willa looked at these things and then she looked at me. The initials can be changed, I said, if she ever wants a different name. Willa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, she wouldn't want a different name. I know, I said. I just wanted her to know it was hers to decide. Willa picked up the carved horse and held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the smooth planes of the wood. The carver in Fenwick was a German named Holst, who had been doing this kind of work for 30 years and knew what he was about. It was a good piece. The horse stood with its head raised, the way Creed stood when he was paying attention to something in the middle distance, alert and still and interested. It looks like Creed, Willa said. I asked Holst to watch him for a week, I said. Through the fence. He wanted to get it right. Willa set the horse back down carefully. She stood there looking at it for a moment. Then she turned and looked at me, and her face was the most open it had been since I came back. Not soft exactly, because Willa's face did not go soft easily, but full. The way a thing looks when it has been closed a long time and is not yet all the way open but is getting there. The way a door looks when someone has finally found the key that fits. I don't know yet, she said. I told you that before. I still don't know yet what I want this to be. I know, I said. But, she said, and stopped. But, I said, and waited. She looked at the carved horse and then back at me. But I think, she said, that a man who asks Holtus to watch his horse for a week, through a fence, so a 9-year-old girl gets the right carving, is probably not a man who is going to leave again. No, I said, he's not. She held my eyes for a long moment. Then she said, come out and help me with supper. I followed her out to the kitchen. April the 14th was a Saturday, which was luck. Saturdays, Ada didn't have school, and the day belonged to the ranch, and whatever we made of it. The morning came in mild and bright, the good kind of April morning that makes you forgive March, and I was up early, and had the horses done, and was at the kitchen table with coffee by the time Willa came out, and she looked at me and said, she's still asleep. Let her sleep, I said. She's been awake since 5, Willa said. She's pretending. I smiled into my coffee. Ada appeared at the kitchen door about 10 minutes later, in her nightgown, and still demonstrably pretending to be a person who had just woken up, and she stopped in the doorway and looked at us and said, good morning, with studied casualness. Good morning, said Willa. Good morning, I said. Happy birthday. Ada looked at me. Whatever she'd been expecting, or steeling herself against, or hoping for, rearranged itself in her face, in the space of about 2 seconds, and she came across the kitchen and stopped in front of my chair and said, you're here. I'm here, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Her hands were at her sides, and her chin was doing that chord set, working something through. Then she said, you promised. I did, I said, 6 years ago, and I'm sorry it took this long to keep it, but I'm here now, and I mean to stay. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she stepped forward and wrapped both arms around my neck, and I put my arms around her, and she held on, not loosely, not briefly, but the way a child holds on when they have been waiting a long time for something, and it has finally arrived. After a while, she let go, and stood up straight, and wiped her eyes in a brisk and businesslike manner, as if getting that out of the way, and she said, what's for breakfast? Willa laughed. It was the first full laugh I'd heard from her since I came home. Not a smile, not a brief movement, but a real laugh, warm and startled out of her, and it filled the kitchen the way a good fire fills a cold room. Ada looked at her mother with the particular satisfaction of a child who has accidentally done something excellent, and then she looked at me, and the gray eyes were bright. We made a proper breakfast, the 3 of us, the way we'd fallen into doing things together in the kitchen on Saturday mornings. Ada breaking eggs with more confidence than accuracy, Willa salvaging the situation with the same calm she brought to everything, me keeping the fire and the coffee and staying out of the way of the actual cooking, which was the only role I'd been assigned, and the only one I was qualified for. After breakfast, I brought the saddlebag and the carved horse from the back room, and set them on the table. Ada looked at them for a long time without touching them. Then she picked up the horse, the way her mother had picked it up, feeling the weight and the planes of it, and she held it up to the window light. It's Creed, she said. It is, I said. She turned it in the light, Holst made it? He did. He watched Creed for a week, she said. Not a question. Mama told you, I said. Mama tells me things, she said, and she set the horse down on the table and looked at the saddlebag, the AC on the flap, and she looked at me. I can change it if I want a different name, she said. Whenever you want, I said. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, I don't want a different name. Good, I said. She picked up the saddlebag and the horse and took them back to her room, and I heard her in there, moving things around, making room, the quiet sounds of a child arranging her possessions the way they belong. Willa was at the counter. I came and stood beside her. She was looking out the window at the kitchen garden along the east wall, the early beans already coming up green, and the April morning was doing what April does when it finally decides to be April. The air was clean and sharp with new grass, and the cottonwoods along the creek would be leafing by the end of the week, and the whole Bitter Sage Flats Valley was moving out of what the winter had made of it, and into something else. She didn't look at me, but she shifted, a small movement, and her shoulder came against mine and stayed. I stood there next to her, and looked out the window at the garden, and the creek, and the morning. I'm going to stay, I said, not asking, telling her, the way you tell someone something that is already true. I know, she said. We stood there for a while in the kitchen, with the April light coming through the window, and Ada moving around in the back room, putting things where they belonged. A man can ride for a thing his whole life. I had ridden for 6 years, back and forth in all manner of directions that were not home, and I had finally pointed toward the one thing worth pointing toward, and come here, to this kitchen, to this woman standing with her shoulder against mine looking out at the garden we'd planted together, to the sound of my daughter in the back room, making space for a carved horse that looked like her horse. I had promised to come home for her birthday. I had come home. Not on the birthday I'd promised, not on the one after that, not for 6 of them. But the promise had not died. It had waited, the way certain things wait, not patiently, not without cost, but stubbornly, the way the creek waits under the ice, still running, somewhere underneath. Ada had held it for me. Willa had held everything for me, the land and the child, and the long possibility of this morning, and neither of them had asked me to thank them for it. Outside the window, the kitchen garden was coming up green, and the April light was warm on the east wall, and somewhere in the barn, Creed would be putting his head over the stall rail, hoping for a visitor with an apple. I put my hand over Willa's on the counter. She turned it over and held mine, briefly, and without making a thing of it, and then she said, Ada will want to take Creed out this afternoon, if the weather holds. I know, I said. I was thinking the same. She nodded and let go, and started in on the dishes, and I got the coffee and refilled both cups, and set hers where she could reach it, and from the back room came the sound of Ada singing to herself, the way she did when she was content, a low, tuneless song that meant everything was where she wanted it. That is the whole of it. Not the prettiest story of how a man comes home, not the kind you'd carve in stone or tell to make yourself look noble, but mine, ours. 6 years gone, and the price of that paid in the daily, incremental, unadorned work of being present and useful and honest about what I was and what I owed, and Willa choosing, not quickly, not easily, but finally, to let me back through the door I had built. I did not deserve it. I know that. I was going to spend the rest of my life being worth it anyway. Ada came back into the kitchen with the carved horse and set it on the window ledge where the light hit it best, where you could see the grain of the wood and the way Holst had caught the set of Creed's head, alert and still and interested, looking out at something in the middle distance. She stood back and considered it. There, she said, that's where it goes. There, that's where it goes. I couldn't have said it better myself.